Hi guys, so I've been through and tidied this up a little bit. I haven't changed much. One thing I changed over here was I changed the expression that was adding the width attribute to our traces. So before, you'll remember, I was increasing the scale here, but what that was giving me was a uniformly thick line for that projectile. So instead I removed that and I came back here, which is basing the width on the alpha, so it will be thicker at the front and thinner at the back, which is what I do want, and I just multiplied that up. So I think this value was 0.001, so now it's quite a lot bigger, and that's working fine. Other than that, this is all the same, and inside here what I've done is I've just written most of this out. So no changes there except for writing it out and changing the p-scale to our 0.001, which we were doing before. And then if you remember, we had that motion blur issue. I didn't save that one. So what I did was just multiplied velocity down by 0.5 on all of these layers, all of the particle layers. And then jumping over to the mantra setup, I've just basically increased the pixel samples on all of these. So you'll see the projectiles are now 8 pixel samples and particles are on 6. And I've also included the scene environment and the character in the matte objects. So every single one of these is being matted out by the environment and by the character. And obviously the environment and the character base renders now extend all the way to frame 220. So that's it. I've rendered out all of these layers, so we can do a very quick comp to see how these are working together, and then hopefully we can start picking up some pace again and jump back into our setup here and add our sci-fi elements. So let's jump into Fusion. I've got the old portal comp open and I'm just bypassing most of the portal related lighting stuff, and the whole portal effect here is bypassed so that we can quickly view what we're doing with the shield. So these are the passes I have. This is the particles inside, and I think it's come out pretty well. This is the main particle render. So nice tiny particles there, almost small enough that you wouldn't know that it's just points. And here's some of my shading layers, and just to show you what I've done, this is the base render, which is just the reflection. And if you take the loader and you come over to format, you can change which channel the EXR is loading, and we have the arcing, netting and normal channels here. So all I have to do is set arcing R, G and B, and I get my extra image plane there. So this has actually worked out really well. And you saw how simple the shader is for this, but I guess what gives it life is the fact that we're using the particle sim to mask out the colors in the shader. So it already feels pretty dynamic, and the noise is just moving up. But obviously we've found that we can clamp that noise with the Worley, add extra turbulence to the rest position to give us these kind of shapes that feel slightly electrical. And the other noise is this one, which is the netting one. It's not moving at all. And then we have just the straight up reflection, and there's our projectile render. So that's all the layers we have for now. So I've just split them off into groups here. So I've got the particle group, which is kind of our background layer. Then all these layers we might add on top. And then obviously, oh, here's the normal one, which I need to extract the blue color so that we get our Fresnel. And I'm going to use that just to color correct some of these layers underneath. And then, oh, this is our outside layer of points, which I also really like. So let's take a look and try and assemble something basic here, just to get an idea of what we've got. So I'm basically going to just start by merging here everything we've got. So I'll have the inside points as a background, and then I'll merge on top these, and I'll start to color correct as I go to try and balance the intensities. So for starters, those inside points can be quite subtle. And I want these outside points to be quite contrasty, because these are the kind of the visual cue, I think, for the impact. They're the most explosive. So if we can get the bright spots to really pop. See over there, they're yellow at the moment, so we can brighten that all up. And maybe jump over to the highlights and boost those even more. And then just generally playing with the level of saturation. You know, we can be quite extreme here at the start, because we can always tone it down like we did with the portal. So I'm trying to kind of blend these together until they feel like they're part of a cohesive looking effect, and nothing stands out as being a completely separate layer. So you can see they're matching the kind of redness of the whole thing. So those white spots are already popping quite nicely. Let me go ahead and duplicate our glow setup from our portal. Just so we can start seeing how this looks as we move down the chain here. So we have those points, this brightness is doing nothing. Our small blur, our medium blur, and our huge blur. I'm going to reset this color corrector because we want a saturated red-orange glow. And what do I see? I see an obvious edge to the medium blur there, so I'm going to boost my large blur and reduce the medium one a little bit. So that's added a nice magical quality to it already. Let's see, maybe could go slightly more golden with it, or I could just saturate that glow and color correct it down the line, but that's good enough now to visualize that one. Then we have these layers. So these are the ones I really wanted to just bulk up this effect and try and get these particle layers to really mesh nicely together. So let's try and force some color out of this. You know what I might do is take this layer and just use the other one as a color corrector. So at the moment I'm just subtly adjusting the saturation values on the color here to get something that matches, and I'll merge this on top and burn it in. Switch off alpha. So if I disable this, yeah, it's looking a bit peach for me. So again, it doesn't need to be super strong. I just need enough to fill in those gaps. So it's really subtle, but if I switch it off, you can see it's adding something. And then I'm going to do that here as I'm going to color correct this layer. So instead of just merging on a completely new layer, I'll just take this one here, plug it into the mask, and boost this layer up. And if I come over here, I can choose which channel my mask is using, and I'll use luminance. So there I can get those arcs inside, and I can even adjust the mask here, or just color correct this layer, and then the luminance value will be affected as well. So that's kind of cool. So this is where I'll spend a lot of my time. It's just kind of tweaking these gammas and gains and just trying to merge these passes together while looking at a semi-final result. So from an artistic perspective, it's the same fundamental rules here. I'm looking for some low detail, medium detail, and high frequency detail to be visible throughout. So I have a bunch of high frequency detail here, and this is kind of my low detail. So all I need is for my high frequency detail to still be quite visible and punchy on top of the low detail stuff, and the purpose of the low detail should fulfill its role by not being completely noticeable, but it's the type of thing that when you remove it, you notice that it's gone. So it's a very subtle act here of just adjusting colors. Trying out different saturation levels. I might go very saturated and just desaturate it later on. So that's pretty cool. That's a bit intense, I think. But that's doing a nice job of really meshing everything together. And then what do we have here? We've got our reflection. So I'll do a quick pass of merging that on top as well. And we'll burn this on again. We only need the bright bits. And let's boost this. So there we've got some reflection. I mean, our portal effects layers are pretty intense. So we're not going to see a reflective surface everywhere. And in fact, it might be a good idea to mask the reflection by this layer. So it's only reflecting where the portal's been hit and where the shockwaves are rippling out. So I'll put a boolean down there and I just plug this into the yellow one and subtract. And then over here I can apply mask inverted. Oh, no, this should be in the blue one. The reflection should be in the yellow one, which is background, and then I want this layer to be in the mask, which is blue. And then I subtract and invert that mask, and I'll set that to luminance. So we're removing most of the reflection here, but it should be the most intense where the impacts are. So let me put down another brightness and contrast here. So there we can see the reflection is reacting to the impacts as well. So that's kind of cool. It's not a constant reflection in the dark areas, but when you see it, you can see a kind of shimmering you can see these speck on the sides. So that's too intense. Go for something like that. Could even color this to kind of tint the reflections to be the same as the rest of the shield. And then we have our normal. So let me save quickly. So with the normal, all I need to do is use a boolean again, and I believe it's the same as a shuffle in Nuke, pretty much. And I just want to extract the blue channel. And I can color correct all of this stuff here. So I'll use the blue channel as a mask, and if I color correct the blue channel, I should be able to bring this down to a value where I get my Fresnel. So something like that. And then we can just brighten up these edges. So it's kind of like how everyone wants everything to be backlit. So if you have a character, you always want some kind of rim light. And for this kind of effect, you really want to highlight the edges. So this is a magical shield, and there's a lot going on, and you can just highlight the whole effect by just brightening up everything there. So plug this into the mask. Make sure our mask is using luminance again, and just crank that up. You can see, so we're just forcing the edges to be brighter. So we have some control there, and we can have a pretty dark interior and a pretty bright edge. So with something like that, I would desaturate as well. So you don't want that brightness to cause overly saturated bright areas, because it stops feeling bright. So you just desaturate the highlights at least, or even if you're brightening up here, we can desaturate the whole thing. And it just makes for a classier effect. So I think this is already looking pretty cool. And then this final layer here, so let's also push this towards red quickly. burn this on as well. All these completely emissive effects can just be burnt on. So it feels a little bit too visible at the moment, but I'm going to look at it through the rest of the comp and onto the background to make sure. Oh, that's a big glow. That's very glowy. So let me knock this back. We'll do what we did last time, and I kind of knock the whole effect back. And then we apply the glow. And then we can bring the colors back after the glow. It doesn't reduce the amount of glow, but the point is to be applying these kind of blurs and color correctors here on a much less intense effect. And at the end of the day, the effect in the shot might look better when it's much less intense. But let's start with this over here. And then as usual, I will always have something at the end, because I'll go pretty extreme on the color differences here, and at the end I'll start to try and grade it all together, so we make sure like we have a certain amount of red, a certain amount of green. We knock it back if we need to, we gamma down so that we get some contrast, and then overall we can desaturate to bring everything basically into the same range. So you can see there I've even just really quickly adding a little bit of uniform color, contrast in terms of having a lower gamma and a higher gain, and then desaturating everything. So I think this is looking pretty good, and it's only going to look better once we get our more sci-fi elements added. But that would basically complete the sort of magical version. So you could take this into a fantasy setting and it would look about right, I think. So obviously we're going sci-fi, so we need some elements in there that have shape, geometric shape, stuff like that. I won't worry about, well, let me do a quick comp of the projectiles. They're looking a little bit dull in this render, so they can be more intense. See our little glow there. The highlights can be very intense, and then I think they just need a little bit more saturation. Yep, that feels better. So a quick test here, I'm not going to bother using any displacers for now until we start to really finalize this effect. This is more to see if I'm happy with the elements I've got there, or if I think there's anything missing or I need to change anything. Like for example, this layer is really bugging me because it just hangs around for too long. But I think that's a matter of keying a color corrector in comp here. But in terms of the actual traces, the look of them, the timing, the initial particle simulations, and the reflections, all of that seems to be working pretty well for me. And like I said, the additional layers, the sci-fi layers, I think they're only going to add extra complexity to this, which is cool. And then when we come back and wrap this comp up, we'll also have a lighting pass. So we need to make a lighting a geolight from one of these layers. So the floor is getting affected by this light. The traces are casting light, maybe. We're going to add some sparks, some smoke, all the secondary effects to the shield. So, but for now, let's concentrate on the shield itself, and we'll save the environment lights and the smoke and sparks for when we're just about finished. So in the next video, we'll tackle those extra elements, possibly render out a few more layers and do one more comp check before we finalize the scene and the comp later this week. So I'll see you in the next video. Hello, welcome back. And so here's where we ended in the previous video. We've done a basic comp of all the more magical style layers, and I think it's looking pretty good. So we'll jump back into Houdini and do the sci-fi ones now, before we start any of the secondary stuff. So make sure we get all the effects that make up the shield out of the way. So let's start first with the one that I had an idea of right at the start, which was the connect adjacent pieces to generate a sort of geometric pattern. So I really like the way this one looks, but I'm going to duplicate this this movement here we added using the SDF to push the points further into the middle, and use that instead of the base sim. So I'm just going to duplicate that over here. Okay. So I still think that looks really cool. And now we get those sharp extensions that should move basically in towards where the character is. So what I'm going to do before that, I'll keep the collision here, and I'm going to duplicate some of the other things we have. So basically this ramp based on age. So we'll get that in there. There's a P scale, I'm not sure we need that at the moment. Is there an alpha? Yes. And now I don't see my connect adjacent. Okay, so it's there, but the P scale is maybe setting the width of the lines, I'm not sure. Let me also just change the background to black for now so we can see. Okay. Yeah, so we're exaggerating that color difference and making sure that our points have an alpha, and I'm going to drive that even further down here. Just make a bit more of an extreme drop-off for the alpha. So there's nothing that I'm particularly aiming for here when I'm adjusting this. I'm just seeing what I get. So already here we're adding basically contrast to the color and the alpha, and I want to see if I can clamp that to a point where it's not going to interfere too much with the character. Obviously I want it to be enough inside the shield that you get a sense of depth. So I think that's pretty cool. And then we'll go ahead and add one of our color ramps as well. So again, with this one, it's because it's quite busy and there's a lot of effects on top, I don't want something too contrasty. So I need a good saturated color that feels kind of flat. So I don't want to have too much sharp highlights versus dark saturated areas. And this should be black, I think. And if my color ramps are bugging out again. I might have to open a previous scene and just double check that my color ramps aren't changing. In future, it's probably good practice to set up color ramps using a wrangle, because I have noticed these SOPs have been buggy now for a few versions at least. This is 17.5 and I'm still getting some strange changes every time I reopen a scene. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now what I'm thinking of doing is actually just scattering points on here instead of rendering the lines, because we could get a unified P-scale and it should match the rest of the effect. So let's see how it goes. There's no harm in trying. So something I'm not sure about here is, I guess at this point I need to re-add the P-scale. So I'm just going to, take this one. So a pretty simple setup here. I mean, all we've done is taken one of those point sims, made less points, and then just used this connect adjacent. And it's pretty sci-fi. Right, so that works for one of them. Maybe do a flipbook of this. Well, let me work on the other layer and we'll merge them together and we can see how they look together. So here's my plan. I have a shield at the origin and it's just a basic sphere, so I just have a grid. And obviously in a lot of the reference I was looking at, especially the sci-fi force fields, they tend to be hexagons, which I'm planning to save for another effect. And so let's steer clear of that. And I'm going to try to find another pattern we can use. So I might just show you an example of how to find a few sort of geometric patterns that we can use to edit the actual mesh. So in a usual case, you could simply put down a remesh. So this should give us some nice equal sized triangles. And then put down a divide. And if we switch on compute dual, we get hexagons. So it's not perfect. And getting a perfect hexagonal mesh is actually quite complicated. But you see, that will work for most cases. So yeah, it is kind of, oops, it is quite extreme how warped some of these pieces get. I think there's easier ways to fix that, like if the original mesh has more perfect squares, or we had used a different type of sphere, so the one that's made out of triangles initially. But you get the idea. In this case, I want to get equal triangles, and we can just use those triangles as our geometric sci-fi pattern. Yeah, so we can increase the iterations here to get a bit of a less warped result. And there's also smoothing on the remesh. What I'm slightly worried about smoothing is if it changes the shape. You can see there, if I went with a smoothed version, I would need to ray the points back on, which I might need to do anyway. So I'm just going to go for a bunch of iterations for now. Maybe 0.15. A little bit smaller. Let's see how this looks. So basically we just have the same mesh, but now we have triangles. And then what can we do? Let's put down a primitive. Because here, well, there's a few things. Like for starters, if we carve this mesh, then we can extract just the edges. So we no longer have any polygons, any polygonal faces or anything like that. We've just got the mesh itself, so the edges. So we could render this as edges, or again scatter points on that. But I feel like we definitely need to play around with these primitives first. So I'll do some transformations on this. And you can see here, ooh, okay, I need to put down a facet. So we have our new mesh, then I can just put down a facet and say unique points. So now each one of these faces is completely unconnected to the one next to it. So then if I rotate, they're no longer joined. So this is a cool little simple SOP effect that I'm actually saving for our decloak later on. In our case here, I just want to shrink these, because if I just shrink them, it should be a lot easier to look at. So let me adjust the width of my wireframe here. So I think that's pretty cool. Let's take this, and what I'm going to do is the same thing I did here with the actual original shield mesh, and I'm going to color this black. And we'll take our same sim, and I'm just going to attribute transfer. So there is a problem here where I guess what the remesh is doing is updating every frame. So I'm going to freeze that. So why is that? It's not moving. So let's just put down a time shift here and make sure it's absolutely static, and then check our remesh. Yeah, so if I remesh, let me switch this off, and then you can see the remesh is updating every frame, because the input, even though it's at the origin, we have a network that's cooking every frame there, because there is a change every frame further up the chain. So if I just freeze that over here and then remesh, I get a static mesh there. And there we go. So, and once again, this could be triangles, or I could end up taking a divide here. I'm trying to quickly think if there's any other interesting ways to add different geometric patterns, but I mean between triangles and hexagons, I guess, well, let's see. So the one option is hexagons, and you see that iteration number here has like vastly improved our hexagon stretching. Let's see. So that's it. That's another option, which is hexagons, but they each made up of small triangles, and that's if you just subdivide this. So that's pretty detailed though. And if I went much bigger, it's still, that's pretty cool. And you guys should try and see what other kind of patterns you come up with. In a magical, I've done a magical shield before in a much more fantasy setting, and what I actually ended up doing was one of the artists on the project painted up some basically shape language, some very smooth organic lines and patterns, and I just projected that as a texture onto the shield. And then the same way I'm doing here, I used the particle sims to reveal and hide those lines that were essentially painted onto the sphere. And so you could do something like that if you want to do a magical version of this, or just play around with what other kind of geometric shapes you can get. And so if I go back to just our triangles, I could also go for something really big. And this is how I'll experiment here, because often it comes back to that lots of high frequency detail, medium, making sure you can visibly see medium level detail, and then something super low to blend everything together. And so this layer could be that part of the low detail, low frequency layer. So let me take what we did here, some color, scatter, and these ramps and this move. And let's merge them together and maybe merge in this sim as well. Well, I can't really see anything. Oh boy. Okay, I guess I need to check my p-scale before I try and visualize disks before this crashes. So where am I setting? Ah, that's alpha. I removed the wrong one here. So I just want this. I'll clean this up later on. Let's Let's try that again. There we go. So I think I might need to tweak some of these. I feel like this color wasn't so yellow before. But here I can rebalance, so maybe adjust some of these color ramps to make sure the patterns underneath are visible. And we still want a combination of bright areas and dark areas. And then the same thing for this one. And I'm gonna go, at this point I could play with the scale of that pattern, but I think I like the smaller one. Okay. Instead of scattering, I'm going to resample. Because even if it's connected points, we'll still just be rendering the points. We can test options for that when we apply the shader and do some test renders. And I think this might be slightly too small. Well, let's just do a quick flipbook of this and see how it looks. It's only really going to come together in the comp. But overall I'm pretty happy with these two layers, because between the two of them, as long as we can blend them nicely in the comp, they should just add that extra level of sci-fi detail that we're looking for. And then in the next video we'll set up the shaders and make sure those render out properly, and then move on to our more natural elements, the secondary stuff. Yeah, so now if you remember, one of our layers is, and I'll just jump back over to Fusion, we have these sort of soft noises that run through the shield. So this geometric pattern we've made on the surface now will just be an extra detail inside of that noise, essentially. And then hopefully the internal connect adjacent pieces will be visible once we're looking at the final effect as more of an internal effect inside. So it's super hard to tell here in a flipbook, and it again is a good reminder just to render stuff out instead of trying to adjust too much when you can only see it in OpenGL. You often just need to render things out and see if they work in the comp. But I actually already like this. I mean, those triangles add quite a lot. We can't really see the internal structure of the connect adjacent. I can see it every now and again, but I think that's just a case of balancing this up in comp. We'll make the triangles pretty subtle, but just visible enough, and then make sure we can really see something internally in the sphere. So that's pretty cool. I mean, that was pretty quick to set up two pretty important extra layers, I think, in this effect. So happy with that, and I'll see you guys in the next video.